I had already been retired for so many years when that memory resurfaced, and it hit me like a punch. Vivid, loud, smelling of hot metal and gunpowder mixed with the cold wind. Sometimes I wonder why certain memories insist on staying while others slip away like water through your fingers. Maybe because some decisions, no matter how simple or improvised, ended up changing someone's fate. In the case of that morning, they changed the life of a pilot I barely knew. But let me go back a bit. It was early 1944. I had been assigned to an improvised Navy base working together with the Army Air Forces, a kind of patched-together operation near the English coast. The idea was simple. Keep fighters and bombers in perfect condition for missions that were getting bolder and bolder over German territory. The Navy crew was short-staffed, and we Army mechanics showed up to fill the gap. And of course, like everything in the war, nobody complained. We just did what needed to be done. In that freezing hangar, the wind cut through the always open door, carrying small bursts of fine rain. The noise was constant, engines being tested, tools clanking, men shouting over the roar of machinery, and in the middle of all that stood the F-6F Hellcat that had arrived crooked, limping, its flaps shaking like torn flags. The pilot, a guy who looked far too young to have seen so much fire, stumbled out. I remember his eyes, wide, frightened, but trying to hide it with a crooked smile. They called him Harris, never asked his first name. With the rotation of personnel during the war, you learned quickly not to form too many bonds. "Can you make her fly tomorrow?" he asked, voice low but steady. I looked at the fuselage and laughed. "Tomorrow? This thing shouldn't even fly next month." He took a deep breath. "I need to go back. My squadron is stuck in Munich. The radio failed, and the mission continues at dawn tomorrow. If I don't return, they'll be one man short in the formation." I'd seen a lot of urgency. Urgency kills. Urgency brings down planes. Urgency leaves families waiting for letters that never arrive. So I shook my head and was about to say no, until I realized he wasn't worried about medals or pride. It was something else. A quiet fear of abandoning his comrades. And that got to me. I spent hours examining that Hellcat. The right wing had taken shrapnel, the hydraulic system was compromised, and the engine coughed like it had been smoking for 40 years nonstop. One of the Navy guys passed by, looked at that wreck, and shouted, "Turner, that one's only going to fly again if you work a miracle." I replied, "Not a miracle, maybe something stupid." The stupid thing started when I decided to dismantle an auxiliary oil pressure system from a completely different plane, an old Avenger torpedo bomber nobody used anymore. It was a real back alley fix, and if anyone caught me doing it, I'd spend days explaining why the hell I was mixing parts that had never been meant for that fighter. But the fit, surprisingly, almost worked. Almost. And as every mechanic knows, almost is where creativity and stubbornness live. I worked through the entire night adjusting bolts, adapting brackets, shaping a fitting with a grinder that would have made any naval engineer faint. The rain got heavier outside, and inside the hangar the yellow light flickered now and then, making it feel like the whole world was breathing along with the machines. I talked to myself. I tend to do that when I'm focused. "If this works, kid," I muttered to the engine, "you're gonna owe me one." When I finished, the engine looked new. Lie. It looked patched, but patched with care, which was the most the war allowed. At 5 in the morning, Harris showed up looking exhausted. "Will she fly?" he asked, nervous. I ran my hand along the fuselage, feeling the cold metal. "She'll fly," I said, then added, staring him down. "But she'll fly because you're going to respect every sound she makes. If you hear anything strange, anything at all, you turn back immediately. Got it?" He nodded. When the engine roared, I felt a strange, almost paternal pride. The adaptation I'd made kept the pressure stable. Not perfect, but stable. The Hellcat taxied down the runway, lifted off heavy, as if it still wasn't sure it could trust me. I followed it with my eyes until it became a tiny dot in the sky. Guessing the outcome? We'd only know hours later. The rest of the morning was torment. Every time I heard a distant engine, my heart tightened. I thought of Mary, of Tommy and Grace. And for a moment I wondered why the hell I was there, risking my own neck so a young pilot could risk his. Maybe that was what kept the war machine running. Ordinary men trying not to let other ordinary men die. When the sound of a familiar engine began approaching the base, I ran outside. And there he was, the Hellcat, limping a little, but intact. When it touched down, I let out a breath I didn't even know I'd been holding. Harris climbed down shaking. From cold, adrenaline, or relief, I couldn't tell. He hugged me without saying anything. Sometimes men do that when they realize they survived by a thread. He gave me that crooked smile and said, "If I survived today, it was because of that crazy thing you did." That echoed in me for decades. That night, wiping grease off my hands, I realized that even if I didn't see myself as a hero, the war had a strange way of putting weight on small decisions. Sometimes a person's life depended on a screw tightened at the right time, or on a makeshift fix improvised at 3 a.m. And that was just the beginning. I should have been sleeping that early afternoon, but truth is, nobody slept well at that base. The cold slipped through every gap, the sound of engines never stopped, and above all, your mind wouldn't shut off. After Harris's takeoff that morning, I felt like I'd gambled all my experience on a single roll of the dice. And even seeing him come back in one piece, my heart was still heavy, as if something about that flight was still unfinished. I was sitting on a crate, rummaging through a messy toolbox, when one of the Navy boys rushed into the hangar, out of breath. "Turner, there's an officer wanting to talk to you, says it's urgent." I looked at him, wiping grease on my pants. Terrible habit, but older than me. "Naval officer or Army?" I asked. "Navy," he replied, jerking his thumb. "And he doesn't look happy." I went to the improvised office, an old table, 2 wobbly chairs, and a massive map of Europe pinned to the wall, full of colored tacks. Behind the table sat a commander with a stone face, the kind of man who seemed to have forgotten how to smile. He didn't invite me to sit. "You're the mechanic who cleared Harris's Hellcat for flight this morning?" I swallowed. "I am." "We received a coded message from the detachment." He held a wrinkled sheet of paper. "Their formation was attacked near Munich. Harris was the only one who managed to keep his engine stable enough to return and help provide cover. Your adaptation kept the Hellcat in the air even under heavy fire." I stepped back. "Is he alive?" I asked, almost voiceless. "He is," the commander replied, firm. "But the mission resumes at dawn tomorrow. Their squad lost 2 pilots. They will need reinforcement." My stomach twisted. It wasn't pride I felt. It was fear. That engine I'd made work by miracle would have to endure another day of hell. What if it failed? What if my little crazy idea was just beginner's luck? The commander continued, "I need you to do a full inspection. Now." I left, carrying an invisible weight on my shoulders. The Hellcat was parked in the corner of the hangar, covered in grime, smoke streaks, and shrapnel stuck like broken teeth. When I approached, I ran my hand along the fuselage like touching an injured animal. "Handled more than I expected," I murmured. Harris showed up soon after. He walked with a slight limp, a cut on his forehead covered with a badly placed bandage. "Turner," he called with that crooked smile. "Looks like your trick worked." "It worked yesterday," I replied. "Now we need it to work tomorrow." He leaned on the plane like leaning on an old friend. "My team got caught in an ambush near the Munich rail station. If I hadn't gone back to help the first time, they'd have been shot down. Tomorrow we're going to try to destroy their supply station. The Luftwaffe's on alert. It's going to be ugly." I knew what he was saying without saying it. If the engine failed now, he wouldn't return. I worked the whole night. The hangar felt like an extension of my own body. Every familiar noise, every smell of solvent. The wind came strong from the sea, making the tarps sway and the lights flicker. Sometimes I paused for a few seconds, and the memory of Mary appeared, clear as if she were beside me. "You have to come back to us," she'd said that last night before I left. Tommy and Grace hugging her legs, not understanding much, but feeling everything. I took a breath and went back to work. I disassembled everything I could, replaced every worn screw, adjusted the pressure in the improvised line, tested the oil flow until my fingers ached from tightening valves. I no longer knew if my adaptation was ingenious or irresponsible. I only knew it needed to work. Harris came by a few times with reheated coffee, trying to help even though he had no knack for tools. "You know," he said at one point, "we always hear about pilots surviving by luck. But nobody talks about the hands that keep these planes in the air. I shrugged. I don't like thinking that way. If I start believing my decisions decide who lives or dies, I freeze. He nodded, respecting my silence. When I finished the inspection, it was almost 5 in the morning. The sky was starting to lighten, that pale gray before sunrise. The commander came to supervise takeoff, hands crossed behind his back, posture carved out of stone. Harris climbed into the cockpit. Before closing the canopy, he looked at me. If I come back, I'll buy you a beer. If I don't, thanks for today. I patted the fuselage lightly and said, You'll come back. But if you hear anything strange, abort the mission. Got it? He laughed. You talk like my father. And I don't even know you, I shot back. The engine roared. This time the sound seemed steadier, stronger. Fruit of my work or just wishful thinking? War doesn't last long enough to answer that kind of question. The Hellcat gained speed and lifted off. I stood on the runway until the plane turned into a speck. The cold wind hit my face, but I barely felt it. I only thought about what awaited him in that sky full of enemy fire, and what it would mean to me if he didn't come back. The next hours were torture. The radio crackled with broken messages, reports of turbulence, visual contact with the Luftwaffe, then silence. Too much silence. I paced back and forth in the hangar, hands greasy, heart heavy. One of the boys tried distracting me, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. And then, a distant sound, first faint, then sharper, a familiar engine. I ran outside, a limping Hellcat, losing altitude, a thin trail of smoke from the left wing, tears in the metal, but alive, alive. When it touched down, skidded half the runway, nearly lost control, but stayed upright. I reached it first. Harris climbed out staggering, smiling through soot. The beer, he said, gripping my shoulder. We'll have to wait. But I owe my skin to you. Again. And he collapsed onto the stretcher. I stood there staring at the plane, torn apart but still breathing. Sometimes I think machines have souls too. Or maybe they just reflect the soul of whoever works on them. That evening, alone in the workshop, I realized what I'd been avoiding. I had saved that pilot's life, and that affected me more than I cared to admit. I never forgot that morning, not because of the mission, nor the engine noise. Those blended with so many similar days. What marked me was the feeling that something in the air was wrong, as if the war inhaled deeper before biting. After Harris's second mission, when he returned by a thread, I was convinced that Hellcat had no business flying again. The fuselage was pitted with bullet holes, the hydraulic system failing at random intervals, and the makeshift fix I'd done was already stretched to its limit. But nobody slept safely in war, and nobody chose when to stop. That night, I barely closed my eyes. I listened to the wind howling outside, the flapping tarps of the hangar. The cold felt like it came from inside, like a persistent thought. When morning came, the news arrived. Turner, the Navy officer said, rushing into the hangar. Harris's squadron detected unexpected movement near Munich. German troops pulling back, depots being emptied. Intelligence wants immediate reconnaissance. My heart sank. There's no other pilot for that. There is. But only one plane has the extra fuel tank and range. His. I closed my eyes for a moment. Felt that wave of frustration and helplessness climb up my chest. The Hellcat. My Hellcat. My madness. My guilt. Or my miracle, depending on the day. It had no conditions to fly again. I knew that. And still. There I was, gathering tools, breathing deep, walking toward the machine like visiting someone in the hospital. Harris showed up soon after, uniform wrinkled, face paler than usual. Looks like I'm going back to my favorite city, he joked. Munich. Hell on earth by then. You shouldn't be flying today, I said flatly. He shrugged. When should I, Turner? When the war ends. If it ends. I said nothing, fiddling with a wrench just to avoid looking at him. I spent hours checking the plane. But this time it didn't matter. Every screw seemed ready to give up. Every part vibrated more than it should. I could have lied. Could have said everything was fine. But I looked him in the eyes. If something goes wrong up there, you won't come back. That was all I could say. He took a deep breath, squeezed my shoulder. I only come back because of you. You've proven that twice. I stood there watching him walk away, putting on his helmet. And in that moment, I didn't feel like a hero. I felt too responsible, as if my invisible signature were on every inch of that tired metal. When the engine started, my chest tightened. The roar was different, rougher, heavier. The Hellcat moved slowly, like an old man standing after hours sitting. I wanted to shout for him to stop, abort, forget the mission, forget the report. But it's hard to stop someone who believes he's protecting others. He gained speed. The runway ended, and the plane climbed. But not like before. It climbed, dragging itself, forcing what little strength my improvised work had left. I stood there watching him disappear into the clouds, and then the waiting began. Hours passing like days. Too much time to think about what I'd done. Too much time to think about what I could have done differently. The radio spat out broken messages. Visual contact. Heavy flak. Pursuing. Lost altitude. The Navy officer paced back and forth, tense. I tried not to listen, but each word felt like a blow. Then silence. Thick silence. Bad silence. I leaned against the hangar wall, closed my eyes, and heard my heart pounding like a hammer on hollow metal. War has moments like that, when you hate everything, including yourself. And right then, I thought I had sent a man to his death. But then, like a twisted miracle, the radio crackled. Hellcat, returning, severe damage, losing altitude. I ran to the runway like a madman. The sky was overcast but far off. A small point wavered, dipping and rising as if fighting its own weight. It was him, the Hellcat, or what was left of it. The landing gear didn't fully extend. The left wing trembled like it would fall off any second. The engine spat dark smoke. "Hold on," I murmured, as if he could hear me. "Just a little more, kid." The plane touched down sideways, skidding, dragging metal across concrete, sparking like the world was splitting open. We ran alongside it as it slid until stopping just meters from the hangar. Harris stumbled out of the cockpit, half carried by medics. He was conscious, breathing fast, blood trickling from his forehead. But alive, alive again. He looked at me with a weak smile. "That engine? Almost blew," he said, laughing and coughing. But I knew, as long as it kept breathing, I had a chance. I couldn't answer. I just put my hand on the fuselage. The metal was hot, scraped, destroyed. And as I looked at that plane that had survived far more than it ever should have, I felt something I can't explain. A mix of pride and guilt, relief and fear. War changes everything. Even a makeshift fix at 3 a.m. becomes the thin line between life and death. Harris was taken to the field hospital. The Hellcat was declared a total loss. I stayed there, sitting, listening to the silence left after so much violence. That evening, closing my eyes, I realized something simple but overwhelming. I wasn't a hero. I didn't want to be a hero. I just wanted everyone to make it home, the same way I wanted to make it back to Mary, Tommy, and Grace. I didn't always succeed. That day I did, and that was enough. O ChatGPT Podcometer Eros. Confira informações importantes. Consulte as P.